Thanks everybody for joining the webinar today. This was a long time in the making, so I'm glad to finally be getting to do this. You see on my title slide here that I don't have any co-authors, and that's because for a long talk like this, there are a lot of people, and I just want to take a couple slides and kind of acknowledge some of the primary contributors to this work. So who we're seeing here are folks that are the primary collaborators and investigators in the Designing Sustainable Landscapes team. This was a project that started over 10 years or so ago, and particularly the second half of my talk will feature a lot of the work from this group. All of us are still kind of actively working on this project. Kevin McGarrigle helped kind of build it. He's since retired. Brad and Ethan are doing the kind of lion's share of the work. But I just want to acknowledge each of these co-authors. Scott and I are kind of leading the project, and Joanna is a fellow Audubonner who's also helping and was one of the original members of this work. Then I want to acknowledge some of my co-workers at the National Audubon Society. It's a really big organization. It's got well over 400 employees, but there's about 20 of us or so, or a little less, that work on the science division for National Audubon Society. This is the group that we're looking at here. Specifically, I work within the Migratory Bird Initiative. And we really develop the science that kind of drives the conservation that Audubon implements. Specifically, I want to just highlight a few folks here. Chad Wilsey, Brooke Bateman, who's the Director of Climate Science within Audubon. Chad is the Vice President and Chief Scientist at Audubon, and Lodum Taylor, who's a GIS analyst. They did a lot of the climate work that I'm going to be presenting on today. So I just wanted to make sure I spotlighted them. So what would a 40-minute talk on climate refugia be without starting off by convincing everybody that already believes in climate change that the climate is changing? I don't think I can see this too many times. I hope you all feel somewhat similar. If we look across the past 1 million or so years, we can see that carbon dioxide in the atmosphere has been relatively constant. And then when we look at how that has changed just over the past, within the past century, there's a dramatic increase. And so it's vastly different from what we've been seeing over a long history. Then when we compare that to the yellow part of this graph, which is the solar energy that the Earth is exposed to over the past, since 1880 or so, you can see that's relatively constant. But despite the fact that solar energy has remained constant, the climate has warmed pretty dramatically, especially over the past 50 or 60 years or so. So I know we all get this, but it's never too much to see this. I certainly don't get sick of it. I think it's important to keep front and center in just about all the work that we do. So, you know, it's a complicated problem, climate change, and we are making small improvements as a community of humans on Earth to try and deal with this problem. Under the best case scenario, as we start to deal with this problem, we're still going to be dealing with the effects of climate change for a long time to come, regardless of what actions we take from this day going forward. We're still going to be having to deal with the effects of climate change. And obviously, when we think about how climate change affects animal populations and biodiversity, this is a problem that's going to face us no matter how effective we are at dealing with climate change. As my introduction kind of alluded to, I'm an ornithologist. I work for the Audubon Society. So of course, I'm going to look through the world with bird-colored glasses. But that's not just because that's my background. It's because birds can really effectively tell us about what's going on with the environment. You know, the canary in the coal mine term is there for a reason. Birds are really effective communicators of what's happening in the environment around them. So I just want to start off by talking a little bit about how climate change is affecting wildlife using birds, understanding that it's much more complex than this, but I do think that they're a good indicator. So egg laying dates are changing. This is just one piece of the breeding biology that is being changed by climate change. There's examples of bald eagles in the upper Midwest shifting their initiation dates by 6 weeks earlier than what's kind of historically the norm. Tree swallows have been known to, they have shifted their laying dates 9 days earlier than what's typically the norm. I think this is just a good overall indicator of how dramatic climate change can affect the breeding biology of species. Body size is changing. They're essentially getting smaller. If we all recall Bergman's rule from our Ecology 101 classes, as animals get closer to the poles, their body sizes are larger. And as animals are in more warmer climates, their body sizes tend to be smaller. So this is an indicator of the global climate warming, given that the in general body sizes are getting smaller. Birds are migrating earlier in general. There's a whole host of studies that talk about the effects of climate change on migration ecology of birds. I'm not going to go into anything specific here, but just to say that it's having a dramatic effect on one of the primary life cycles of not only birds, but other migratory species. And because of that, there's kind of this resulting mismatch between the environment and the ecology and the breeding biology of a lot of species. Arrival on the breeding grounds changes. That changes when eggs are laid, which changes when available food is accessible to birds and how they can feed their nestlings. There's a whole cascade of effects that can occur because this timing mismatches. Ecological communities are disrupted. If you all recall, a few years back, there was dramatic warming in the Gulf of Alaska that led to food resource die-offs, which then led to tens of thousands of seabirds washing off on shore. That's just kind of a pretty stark reminder of how tightly wound these ecological systems are to the climate and the abiotic systems around us. And then, of course, the climate is disrupting and changing the distribution of species. Again, there's a whole body of literature out there that has documented changes in distributional shifts of birds and other animals. But I'm just going to go into a little bit of some of Audubon's work to kind of highlight the survival by degrees efforts that have been going on at Audubon over the past few years that I think is a really great example that shows how we expect species distributions to change over time due to climate change. So this was a pretty robust data set by any measure. There were over 140 million observations that this analysis that I'm going to talk to you about was based on from over 70 data sources, and this was for over 600 species of birds across North America. Just to quickly talk about what has gone into these species distribution models, of course, climate, the climate models were updated from the original version of this effort. Land use was included in this effort, land use categories, changes in vegetation, and models were kind of specific towards species groups. So it wasn't a kind of one size fits all model across all different bird groups. It really was a robust and kind of state-of-the-art modeling effort. When we think about the climate models that were included here, they were really meant to reflect changes in the warming of the climate. So there were 3 different scenarios. One was at 1.5%, where a species likely to be found given a 1.5% Celsius warming. That's the best case scenario if there was a really aggressive effort towards reducing greenhouse gases and fossil fuels. 2 degrees Celsius, 2 degrees Celsius is where the IPCC has said if we go past that mark, we're likely to see really dramatic and catastrophic effects across the globe. And then, of course, 3 degrees increase is essentially on the trajectory that we're on now. So all of the results of modeling our species distributions were based on these three climate scenarios. And essentially, these are species distribution models that show us the projections of where the species is likely to be distributed across space, given those temperature changes. And so the reds and oranges are places where a species is likely to lose part of its distribution. The yellows and greens are where the distribution is likely to remain stable. And then the blue is where distributions are likely to expand. So we've done this across the 600 plus species, and we kind of quantified to what extent have these distributions affected species kind of viability. And the results were pretty stark. 2/3 of North American bird species were at risk of extinction from climate change based on that analysis. This is all summarized in the Survival by Degrees report, and there's a website and associated papers. If we kind of look at how this breaks down by species groups and habitat types, I've kind of highlighted here the groups that are kind of most relevant to the east. So we have our boreal forest species. About 98% of those species were found to be vulnerable to extinction based on climate change. About 78% of the waterbird species were found to be vulnerable. 59% of eastern forest birds are found to be vulnerable. And then almost 40% of urban and suburban birds were found to be vulnerable based on climate change. So this is just kind of a nice assessment of how climate change might be influencing the distribution of species into the future. And of course, this is all taken in the context of the recent paper that was published by Ken Rosenberg and Pete Mara and a bunch of other folks throughout the ornithological community that found that about almost 3 billion birds have been lost since 1970. That's essentially like saying 1 in 4 birds since 1970 are now gone. That's a pretty, these two findings are a pretty dramatic juxtaposition of where we are and what birds might be capable of telling us. And when we think about those two results in the context of a project that was funded by the NECASC a few years back and was led by Joel Ralston, where we found that for species that have negative population trends, so all these species on this side of zero, we found that they're more likely to lag behind climate change. So they're not able to shift their distribution to track climate change. So we know that there are a lot of species that are declining. And we know that climate change is putting a lot of these wildlife populations at risk, like we just saw from Survival by Degrees. And that those declining populations are less capable of tracking the changing climate. So this is all one big kind of tangled web. It's a little bit depressing, but it's encouraging that we are at least able to kind of begin to understand this. We have all these kind of multiple factors occurring at once, and it's kind of up to us to start to try and untangle them. So, you know, this is a NECASC talk, and I'm sure many of you have seen some of Tony Lynn Morelli's work that talks about climate refugia. And climate refugia is certainly one strategy, one effective strategy that we can think about when we want to develop conservation plans given climate change. The definition that she used in her 2016 paper is that climate change are areas of relatively buffered from contemporary climate change that enable persistence of valued physical, ecological, and socio-ecological resources. So essentially, you know, if a species is in one place, is it likely to remain in that place? Are the conditions likely to remain suitable? And oftentimes that suitability is determined by several factors. We can think about whether or not the climate will remain suitable. Is it unlikely to change? Is habitat likely to remain suitable over time that can define refugia. There are also several others that are more difficult to measure, like competition and disease and more. The list goes on and on. But when we're considering refugia, I think it's really important to try and understand the role that habitat suitability and consistency plays when we think about climate suitability and consistency. So to that end, this is another project that was funded by the necasc that funded Tim Duclos, who was a climate fellow. And in this project, we looked at to what extent is climate a direct versus indirect effect when we think about the distribution and abundance of, I think it was about 20 bird species along elevational gradients in the Northern Appalachians. So we used structured equation modeling, and we essentially assessed the extent to which precipitation and temperature drives habitat, which then ultimately drives abundance, versus to what extent do these climate variables directly influence species abundance. And so what we're looking at here on the left is the model for ovenbird, and we can see that both precipitation has a direct and indirect effect through habitat on ovenbird abundance, whereas a species like black-throated blue warbler, most of the climate effects were mediated indirectly through habitat characteristics, which then ultimately influence species abundance. So we did this for, like I said, about 20 species. And one of the things that we found was it varied by species. Some species were really driven primarily by direct effects of climate, while other species were really primarily driven by the effects of habitat and how climate might affect habitat. So that's something that's important to keep in mind when we think about refugia moving forward. I want to provide another example that I was recently involved with at Audubon that kind of looked at something similar that really tries to understand the extent to which habitat and land use affects species distribution as opposed to climate. And for this project, we looked at about 100 years of data using the Christmas bird count, and we specifically looked at the effect of land use, land cover change, and climate on winter bird distribution. This effort was led by, sorry, I just dumped my mouth. This effort was led by Sarah Saunders and Tim Meehan. And so the upper panels here are the spatial change in temperature. So the yellows are increase in temperature, and this is change in precipitation. The blues are increases in precipitation. And then this is a look at changes in land use, land cover change across urban, grassland, cropland, forest, and wetland. Again, the yellows are decreases and the blues are increases. So you can get a feel of how these land use, land cover changes spatially over North America or Eastern North America. And then of course, we can look at the change in the distribution. So these are 9 different bird species groups, and the yellow areas are where probability of occupancy decreased, and the bluish green areas are places where they've increased. So we know that land cover is changing over that time. We know that climate is changing over that time, and we know that the species distributions are changing over that time. So now when we parse out those effects, we can see, so these lighter areas are the percent change in deviance explained by the generalized additive mixed models. So for large forest birds, we can see that most of the deviance explained was because of land use, land cover change. But for water birds, we can see that most of the deviance explained was due to climate change. We look at these 3 groups in the middle here: waterfowl, wetland passerines, and grassland birds, and we can see that in general, climate change was driving the changes in distribution, but it was relatively similar. And then for these species groups down towards the bottom, we can see that climate change was really the primary force in driving the changes in species distribution. So, you know, across those 2 studies and some other studies that I didn't highlight here, I think it highlights the fact that climate change is really important when we think about refugia. It's important to think about that as a driving force, but it's also important to think about other aspects when we think about how the landscape might be changing and how that might affect species distributions. A few other things that are worth considering are whether or not we think about single versus multi-species refugia, and then specifically how we actually map refugia. There are a lot of different approaches. And so I just want to go into a recent effort that we've been working on at Audubon that kind of compares and contrasts different approaches to identifying climate refugia. So the classic approach essentially identifies locations where species are found today and where they're likely to remain in the future. And that's kind of more a species by species definition, but we can also think about that from a multi-species consideration. And there are a few papers that kind of define multi-species refugia as whether or not at least 70% of a species within a community at a specific location is retained over time. That's kind of more of a multi-species consideration. And that's what we focused on for this comparison that I'm going to talk to you about. So we compared this multi-species classic approach to an approach that was developed by some of the folks at Audubon called climate strongholds. And strongholds are a slightly different twist on refugia. They're meant to identify locations that are suitable for most species for the longest amount of time. And what really sets this approach apart is it's based off of a prioritization optimization. It uses the software zonation. And it's meant to identify places that have high integrity over time, so high habitat capability over time, and it incorporates habitat quality. It's also meant to identify places, obviously, that have high climate suitability over time. Because it's an optimization approach, it's relatively efficient. So the solution that you get is essentially the minimum amount of area to get the goals that you're after. And we can put higher weight on more recent future time steps because we know that as we go further out in time, there's more and more uncertainty. So we just wanted to kind of compare kind of an alternative, relatively novel approach to identifying refugia, which is the climate strongholds, to the classic multi-species approach of identifying refugia. And this just looks at the overlap among those two approaches based on different biogeographical considerations. So we can see that for biogeographies in Alaska and the Western US, there was not a lot of overlap between refugia and climate strongholds. And when we come down here to like urban areas in eastern portion of North America, marshlands, Pacific beaches, we can see some high overlap between the classic refugia identification and climate strongholds. But the reality is that it really varies across these biogeographies. So this is a graph that looks at the mean biodiversity value for each of these biogeographies. Strongholds is in this orangey color and refugia is this green color, so that we can compare across rows which has a higher biodiversity value. The biodiversity value is kind of a metric across several different species richness and biodiversity metrics. And we can see that for several of these biogeographies, strongholds do a much better job of capturing biodiversity. For several of these biogeographies, they're relatively similar, but strongholds typically do have higher biodiversity when compared to classic climate refugia. Here we used major axis regression. So this dotted line is the one-to-one line. And depending on which side of that one-to-one line the model line is, we can say that it's a stronger effect for strongholds versus a stronger effect for refugia. And here we looked at the change in coldest temperature, the proportion of each of those that were protected, the change in precipitation over time, the mean elevation across the two strategies, and mean habitat condition. So Refugia has less change in coldest temperatures, so it does a better job at retaining colder temperatures over time. Strongholds have less change in precipitation. Refugia is more likely to be at higher elevations. More refugia is already protected, so refugia is better represented in the protected network that currently exists, and strongholds have better habitat condition. So kind of the takeaways from that is that multiple perspectives are important. We might want to consider multiple views of refugia, not necessarily one or the other. And when we do that, we can then prioritize locations that are identified as both when we think about different perspectives of identifying refugia. And the way we've been kind of thinking about it without going too far into it is that strongholds can be used to identify broader spatial networks, so at a broader spatial scale, while refugia might be stronger at locating finer scaled focal areas for protection. So now I just want to shift gears a little bit and talk a little bit about the idea of considering connectivity when we think about climate refugia. And this is all based on some work that was recently funded by the necasc and some future work that the Design Sustainable Landscapes is going to be working on. First, I just want to provide a little bit of context for this project. The Designing Sustainable Landscapes kind of team and project has been going on for over 10 years. At its broadest sense, it's a stakeholder-driven science effort to inform strategic landscape conservation in the face of climate and land use changes. That's what it is at its kind of way zoomed out level. The first project that we were a part of was Connectivi, Connecticut, which was kind of the epitome of a stakeholder-driven landscape conservation design network that we did for the Connecticut River watershed. Once we kind of learned how to do that at that scale, we scaled it up at a regional level and worked really closely with the Northeast region of the Fish and Wildlife Service to develop Nature's Network. Again, that's a landscape conservation design that incorporates climate change and urban growth to help prioritize locations for conservation. The general approach that we have taken throughout this whole process is that we use spatial models to characterize the current landscape and current kind of abiotic conditions. We use those then to develop ecological assessments for both species and ecosystems. We then use land use and climate change models to get a picture of what the future might look like, and then apply those ecological assessments to that future picture. And then all of that, including each of these steps, we work with stakeholders to kind of apply this in a co-developed way. And I have this rectangle here to include social vulnerability metrics, which is something that we're striving to include as we continue down the road of this project. So the project that I'm going to talk to you about really looks, like I said, about the importance of connectivity when we think about refugia. Refugia itself is a restricted version of the current distribution. Here, this is Blackburnian warbler. The blue areas are where we would likely find them in 2020. And you can see in 2080, that network is severely restricted. We also know that landscape connectivity is really important for wildlife population dynamics, particularly when we think about metapopulation dynamics, when we think about dispersal, migration, longer-term generational movements. Of course, connectivity is also important for within seasonal movements, but that's not really what the perspective that we focused on for this project. So the objectives for this effort was to estimate updated refugia networks for 10 focal species, and then develop an approach to assess the extent to which refugia networks in the Northeast are connected, taking into account both local and regional scales. We really wanted to be able to identify areas that were important for refugia networks that had high refugia value as well as high connectivity values. So as I mentioned, we worked with federal agencies, NGOs, and states to identify 10 focal species for this project. These aren't meant to be comprehensive. We did try and make sure we had a range of species and that they represented a range of different habitat types, but it wasn't meant to be any kind of magic combination of these 10 species. And for the designing sustainable landscape projects, we did have a lot of considerations when we thought about climate refugia, but specifically for this project, we only looked at RCP 8.5. Our original version looked at both 4.5 and 8.5, but now 4.5 is becoming kind of almost unrealistic given where we are. And our definition of refugia are where were places that had suitable climate in the current time step and suitable climate in 2080. That was our definition of climate refugia, even though I said we have different combinations that we could have considered. And so these are two examples of climate refugia, one for wood turtle. The green areas are refugia, the purple areas are places that are likely to be gained. And in contrast, this is bicknails thrush on the right, where the orange areas are places that they exist now but are likely to be lost, and the green are just refugia. And so we did this for each species to get kind of an assessment to what extent habitat will be lost over time. And so if we look at all of our species here on the x-axis, we can see the percent of current habitat change, the percent of current habitat that will remain in the Northeast as refugia. And so we can see for box turtle and moose, and to some extent maybe wood turtle, you know, a good amount of their habitat will remain in the Northeast. But for some species like salt marsh sparrow and cerulean warbler, bicknails thrush, blackburnian, American woodcock, almost all of their habitat in the Northeast essentially will be gone by 2080. So that really makes identifying connections between these places all that much more important. So we identified connectivity at both local scales, where we use this random low-cost path approach, where many randomized pathways are kind of modeled in between the cores, and the existing landscape provides resistance, so that for a wood turtle, forested areas, riparian areas would provide low resistance, and something like roads or urban areas would provide high resistance. And so we can see that the landscape varies in terms of how easily a wood turtle can cross through and connect from one refugia core to another. And so the result is this map that depicts these areas of local consideration for connectivity. You know, we have our refugia value based on the habitat quality or landscape capability. And then we can also think about prioritizing areas that are important for connecting, for the local connections between high refugia value locations. This is something, a tool that a manager can use to prioritize conservation and habitat management. And then we also wanted to think about connectivity at a more regional approach. And that's a little bit more comprehensive and a little bit more difficult to do computationally. So we applied a graph theory approach, which is essentially an assessment of the importance of each core in the connection of the entire network. So it looks at how important is each core for connecting all the other cores in a network, where the core areas, the refugia areas, are considered nodes, and the edges of the connections between them. And this approach is really efficient at dealing with large data sets. There are several different metrics that you can get: closeness, betweenness, strength. They're all essentially different flavors of kind of assessing how well each core and how important each core is for the overall network. And so right here, we're looking at closeness, which is essential. How central is each core to the network? It's a kind of a measure of centrality. And you can see that the cores vary on that scale. Some are more important than others when we think about this kind of regional connectivity for closeness. We put all this together into one refugia score. So we had those three measures of regional connectivity. We had the 2020 landscape capability, which is how capable is a landscape for providing current habitat, our 2080 refugia scores. And we did that for each of the 10 species, so that we kind of have a really comprehensive rank a Refugia rank for each of those 10 species that take into account habitat quality and different measures of connectivity, which I think is a relatively novel approach for looking at Refugia. And then we look at the change in connectivity over time between 2020 and 2080. On the left side, we have the initial state. So we have species that are well connected today, some species that are unconnected today, their Refugia or their habitat cores, and then how that will change over time. So we have this group of species that are relatively well connected and will remain connected over time. Then we have another group of species that are relatively connected today, but their Refugia network is likely to become unconnected. And then we have some species that are relatively unconnected today and will likely stay unconnected. So this just goes to show that you can't think about connectivity across species the same. You have to consider it because it varies across species. So how could we apply these tools? This can certainly be used to inform regional landscape conservation design for all the ways that I just listed. We've developed spatial tools that can assess both the local and regional connectivity of species Refugia networks. As I just mentioned, species are responding differently in the quantification of that Refugia network that's likely to change. And several species will have really limited Refugia networks in the Northeast. That's kind of what I talked about with Blackburnian warbler and Bicknell's thrush. They're essentially left with almost nothing moving forward. So our next steps, we're going to be working again with the necasc to develop a regional ecosystem-based connectivity tool. Given that current rapid rate of change and that Refugia might not be the best strategy for some species, this regional ecosystem-based connectivity could be a really great way to help facilitate and complement some of the Refugia strategies that we have. It focuses, like I said, on regional connectivity, and it's specific to ecosystems. So it tries to say that animals that live within wetlands are more likely to move regionally through like habitat. So wetland species are more likely to move through wetland type habitats. And this can benefit multiple species in those ecosystems. So it's not specific to any one species. We think that this is going to be a really useful tool to complement climate Refugia strategies where we can think about these regional movements at ecosystem levels. And we're really excited to get this project underway. So to kind of just boil all that 40 minutes or whatever it was into a few key takeaways, I think that everything we looked at today kind of still shows that Refugia can be an effective conservation strategy for climate change resilience. No matter what we do to curb climate change, we're going to be dealing with its effects for the foreseeable future, and thinking about applying climate Refugia strategies to deal with it is going to be really important. But there's a lot to consider when we think about climate Refugia as a strategy. I think it's important, as we saw today, to consider climate and habitat, to have some understanding of the mechanisms by which Refugia might be defined. I think it's important to consider varying approaches to deriving Refugia, whether it's a climate stronghold, more optimization approach versus a multi-species and classic approach. And I think it's really important to consider connectivity of that climate change Refugia network. That is starting to become more and more prominent in the literature. And I think that the work that we've started with necasc and will be continuing to do will really put that idea front and center. And then finally, Refugia isn't the only solution. You know, potentially focusing on regional ecosystem-based connectivity that I just described can help facilitate species shifting distribution, so that we have a Refugia layer and a kind of connectivity layer at the ecosystem level that can kind of work together to inform conservation can be really important. With that, I would like to thank everyone for spending some time today to talk about this, and maybe we can take some questions.